Happy Sunday, October 20th. It's April Jackson here from Open Up, and I'm so excited. I say that every month, but I really am because it's like a whole month before I get to be in fellowship with Wesley Hamilton. How are you, Wesley?
I'm doing well. I'm blessed. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm doing well. It's nice. The sun is beaming right where I need it this morning. Taking care of my plants. If you can see them in the background, some of my
I just moved
uh, being a plant dad is really exciting this morning because the sun is amazing.
Nice. I told you, like when you got on, I was like, "Ooh, the glow."
Yes.
It's good to see you, and we're so happy to have Virginia Cumberbatch as our guest this morning.
Hello,
I can't
Virginia.
wait to, for you all to hear about her personal journey, the work that she does, her work with Rosa Rebellion, and we've been trying to get her here. Like she's in demand, and she's just an amazing person. So, um, Virginia, before you start, I just want to share. I want you to introduce yourself. But I heard about you years ago. I just cycled off. I guess I'm still kind of on, but 2.5 years of being a Lululemon ambassador.
Oh, cool.
And our board member Richard Butler was an ambassador, and I don't know if he's still a legacy ambassador, but he did it for a while. And you presented to Lululemon their team, the ambassadors, years ago, and he sent me your information. He's like, you need to reach out to them. You need to listen to them. Like they're amazing. And so it came full circle when a member of our team came on, new Ania, and we were trying to, brainstorm on who would be some really good guests. And she mentioned you. I was like, I've totally heard of this woman. So I feel like it's come full circle, and Ania's behind the scenes helping us with the work.
Awesome. Yeah, what a small world. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. It's always such a blessing just to be in community and in conversation with folks who are just doing really beautiful work in this world. And I didn't know about that Lululemon connection. I sat on the IDEA board, which is Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Action for Lululemon for a couple of years. And so I was really excited to just be able to be in conversation with some incredible ambassadors. So good to know that you were part of that community as well.
I was. Thank you. So can you please, like we've introduced your name, kind of, I gave some history. Can you share about what you do?
Sure. This is like my least favorite part of any conversation that I have. I'm just like, let's skip that. Let's just get into the conversation. But yeah, I mean, I always say that my work sits at the intersection of racial justice, community equity, and storytelling. So I really feel that my purpose in life is to tell untold stories and disrupt unjust systems. And I think one of the best ways to do that is by elevating our voices in meaningful ways. And so I've done that in a few, spaces and infrastructure throughout my adulthood. Prior to launching Rosa Rebellion, I served as the director for the Center for Community Engagement and the Social Justice Institute at the University of Texas in Austin. And that was really, taking on that role was really interesting timing. That was, I was right out of grad school. This is, a couple of years after Ferguson, and just sort of the viralization and visualization around the trauma of Black and Brown bodies at the hands of institutions like policing. And, I was kind of tasked with building connection and trust with the community on behalf of this university that, in all fairness, had not always been a good neighbor, who had not always been a good community steward. And so in that process, really developed an understanding of the ways in which we sometimes silo voices, right, and silence voices, and then create this dynamic where folks with certain letters behind their names, they're the experts, right, and they get to tell community how to make their lived experience better. And I, was really adamant about us creating safe spaces, affirming spaces that actually positioned community to be not only the experts, but the authority of their own lived experience. And what happens when we can build collective action. And so that work kind of propelled me into launching Rosa Rebellion alongside my co-founder, Megan Harding. Her background is as a civil rights attorney, mostly working in the criminal legal space, and mine was in racial justice. And we just felt that as two Black women, as two women of color doing this work, we often felt that, not often felt, the reality was we were the least resourced, right? And we were like, what would it look like if we created a space that unapologetically centered what we call creative activism, which is an acknowledgement that we've always been doing the work of disruption, right? It is part of our reality as melanated people in this country, right? Navigating systems and spaces that weren't built for us. But what happens if we create spaces that center that creative activism and resource that creative activism? So we launched in 2019 at South by Southwest with our first signature program, which was called Rebel and Rest. And it really was our understanding that we knew what it was like to feel burnt out. We knew what it was like to feel exhausted by these spaces and systems. So what happens if we create a space where we center our rest in the midst of our resistance? And we do this work from a posture of peace and joy, and don't let these systems, get to steal that from us. And then since then, we just celebrated our 5-year anniversary this past September. We've launched another, and our Rebel and Rest program was in partnership with Lululemon for several years. And then we have a program called Compose, which is a writing and storytelling incubator in partnership with Soho House, where we support 10 women of color who are using storytelling as a modality for racial justice. And we help get their projects to production. And then we have the Rebel Fund, which is our 501c3 arm, where we every other year offer $30,000 to women of color that we just want to unapologetically write checks to because they're doing the work. And hopefully in the midst, kind of disrupt and dismantle the very white-centric practice of philanthropy and impact investing. So yeah, that's the work I've been doing for the past few years. In connection to that, I do racial justice, racial equity education with brands, mostly in the US, but a lot in Europe as well, just sort of challenging them on what it looks like to build a pervasive ethos of equity in their brand experience.
You don't need me to be proud of you, but I am. Just, it's my heart is full to hear, and I am interpreting this as like you went out there and you did the work, and you're doing the work, and it sounds to me like you decided, you took ownership, and you decided what you wanted to do as opposed to letting somebody else dictate it. And I love hearing all these branches that have spurred out of yourself and your business partner. So thank you for doing the work.
Oh, thank you. Thanks I appreciate that encouragement and affirmation because, I'm sure as we all feels like the world is on fire right now and there are so many intersecting harms. And so in the midst that it feels good to be in a space of encouragement. So I appreciate that.
No, I love that. And thank you for sharing the work you're doing. It's exciting to see a woman of color in this work and understanding the value of uplifting others, just like yourself. And so I think that that's powerful. And so again, I feel the voice, right? Just the transparency on the approach that you provided just lets me know that you use your voice very well. And I'm grateful to hear that power, especially this morning. You said that you've kind of worked with, I'm learning about this space a little bit more through the work that I do. And I'm focused more with individuals with physical disabilities, but you run into racial injustice within that. Is there any, just curious, so some of the entities, is there any I feel like you gave us like a scope, but I want to is there like a milestone that you could share or something from the work that you've done and seeing like some of the impact that has happened from it? Maybe that way I can get a little bit more of that internal work that's being done.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just have to acknowledge that this light that you've got going on, Wesley, is like the angels of heaven are shining upon you this Sunday, and I'm just trying to figure out like how we make that happen where me and April are. But
Right? I'm like looking at the windows. I'm like, what do I
I'm
need
like,
to
oh my
do?
gosh, I'm like he's the glow. But yeah, thank you so much for one, just the work that you do and that April, that you and April do. I would say just as like a foundation to start, right? That I think that is one of the most confronting or like frustrating components, right, of doing this work of equity in whatever vertical area that you are working in, right, is that not to be hyperbolic, but this country, right, was built on the premise, right, of those who would have and those who would not, and we know that that is so inextricably connected to the harms of racial injustice. And so, particularly in the work that I do, that usually is centered at, through Rosa Rebellion at least, centered at the intersection of gender and race. But, one of the things that I always talk about, when doing equity work with brands, they want to kind of parse it out as this like individual special project. And I'm like, no, we don't have economic justice without racial justice. We don't have environmental justice without racial justice. We don't have disability equity without racial justice. And that it's not just a nuance, it is the reality of our life. We know so much about, usually when we think about the heroes and or who the world heralds as heroes and the voices of communities like disability community, they don't always fully represent, right, us. And so I think it's critical that we continue to center race, not as a way of I think the backlash of that is always like, oh, it's always about race. It's like, well, it's going to be until it's not, and it's not, and it still is, right? So I think one of the ways that we've seen, to answer the second part of your question, sort of impact, I think the other part is us getting comfortable with the fact that progress and impact isn't always measurable. And I think because we live in a very like capitalistic world, right? Kind of a colonizer mindset is to be able to perfectly summarize what we did in a year in a beautiful annual report. And the truth is, some of the most powerful, meaningful stories can't be captured in that way. And so I've even had to get comfortable with that, particularly coming out of a system like higher education, where I'm constantly having to prove like, no, this was really powerful and this is why this should get funded. And so to me, some of the most special outcomes of our programs is like hearing those stories, right? So one of our programs is called Compose, like I mentioned, and that was really us recognizing that, we don't get policy change and shift. We don't change infrastructures unless we've centered the stories of those who are the most marginalized. And if we aren't the authors of those stories, then our stories are being silenced, siloed, or just completely erased. And so we were like, there's a connective thread here. Our voices are lacking in some of these larger discourses. And so it's a 3-day retreat. And then we pair our cohort with mentors. And these are documentary filmmakers. These are podcast hosts. These are editorial writers. These are multimedia storytellers. And all of their stories are connected to racial justice. And our first cohort, we had a filmmaker who is Indigenous to Hawaii. And this was, 2022, right? So we're kind of coming in we're still in the pandemic, but like, the crux of the pandemic. So there'd been a lot of conversations about Native Hawaiians asking folks to stop coming because they were like, prices were going up and their resources were few. So anyway, she was working on this beautiful short film that basically was an analogy for the ways in which Western culture had sort of raped and pillaged the land of Hawaii, right? And sort of extracted natural resources with a story of a young woman being assaulted and taken advantage of. And it's this beautiful story. So that was a product she brought into our cohort. And through our partnerships, she was able to, bring the film to production. It got picked up by a bunch of film festivals, and the film premieres literally less than 2 weeks before the Maui fires, which is like, you could not have, and then her film ends up being used as this amazing fundraising effort and she's from Maui. Like, her mother had like their businesses on the small island. And then the partnership with Soho House, which was able to do a filming and a fundraiser there. And so it was just this, like, one of those ways where things you didn't even anticipate, right? Where you think the outcome is going to be great. We get this film out into the world, and then the impact that it can have on truly advocating for this land that had been destroyed, and not just destroyed out of, happenstance, but destroyed because of the repercussions of us not caring for our land and caring and, pursuing climate protection. So I think that's just like one example that comes to mind.
Oh, I love that. And thank you so much. I really, this felt very affirming in a lot of ways. I've been running my nonprofit since 2015. And so we've done amazing, but lately, and it's lived experience. I'm paralyzed from the waist down. I was shot multiple times in my abdomen. So for me, like hearing like you, it's like having that lived experience. You do focus a little bit more on that impact over what's measurable. And so that was affirming, because I always say, I would like to go longer with the individuals we serve so that we can make that impact really be instilled. And, a lot of that comes with maybe a little bit more longevity in your programming. But when you think about just what impact is, and then also storytelling, we do have a side where, to me, that is the important part, because once you can understand stories, everyone gets a new perspective just on all things. And so I think that was very affirming. But I love the work you do. I'm also a single father. My daughter's 15. So this is, and I've had custody ever since she's 2. So to have like women that are leaders and doing things that are creating change and making sure impact happens, that's also always good in a reflection. These calls are always good because April always brings in the best people for these calls. And so I'm just saying, definitely heart is full with the work, and you are very right. Everything is rooted into race, and it is a lot of work to be done. And then once you can kind of hone into that, then you can start to assist in those other areas. Because even for me within the disability space, a lot of the conversations are based around race, the lens that disability is seen first. So, no, thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, you definitely resonate with how we came together and what we decided. We decided like race was the ground floor, like equity and justice for Black folks. Like Wes, he said quite often, like, before I was disabled, I was a Black man, and I'm still a Black man. And the disabilities, quote, that came with that have amplified with the disabilities. And I'm curious about this because the focus and centering around women and Black women, I've been on my own journey of healing, and I still am. which put me into the category of having an invisible disability. And in my mind, like all my life, literally, I'm like, I'm healthy, I'm fit. Like I'm known as like the fitness person, and I was humbled and thrown to the floor and stomped on and rolled around. um, and I shall rise, and still I rise. But how do you have any like experience or stories or anything you even want to share? Because I've recognized, like, my mother died of breast cancer, and she too, she was, older, but she was a
Yeah.
young woman, healthy, full of life. And I recognized the stress, and in hindsight, I'm like, damn, the stuff she dealt with,
Yeah.
and I didn't even think about it. And like, how many women, how many of us are succumbing because the trauma, the gender stress, the racial stress has like taken a toll. So I love that you're doing the rest. And I'm curious about what brought you to that and your experience with our people.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for just like your own vulnerability and transparency in your own story. And yeah, just like the beautiful ways that in the midst, right, you are still present. Um, it's layered, but it's Sunday. So we go, I'll take off, be a little bit more
You can do
forthright.
church.
So I think so. Um, so just a little bit of like personal background. So I'm from Austin, Texas, born and raised, which we don't know a lot about Austin. Austin's a beautiful city. I feel very blessed to have been raised there, but it's a very white city. And I don't just mean that in terms of populace. I also mean that in terms of the infrastructure, particularly the cultural infrastructure that gets to take center stage, right? And so most of my life was being nurtured, even if it was unconscious, around how to navigate spaces and systems that were not innately built for me. Like point blank, me, people who looked like me, my family were not top of mind when that institution was built, when that neighborhood was created, right? Down to the house that my parents moved us to, and they bought in like the 90s, like early mid 90s. Still had on the deed of the house that like no Negroes could live here. And it took like an extra few months for my parents to close on the house because my dad sued like I don't know, the county or whatnot to get that removed from the house deed. He's like, I'm not, my dad's from New York. So he's like, what the heck? And it turns out you cannot change public record. So that was still on our house deed. So like, I'm 6 at the time, so I'm not necessarily fully comprehending, right? But these are all understandings about how I've been invited to navigate this world. And I think language is really important. It wasn't until my adulthood that even the idea of racial trauma, not just the term, right, but the idea that I had permission to acknowledge that what I had experienced throughout my life, regardless of the fact of how well I adjusted or matriculated, and the schools I went to, like regardless of that, I had experienced racial trauma throughout my life, right? And there's real power in acknowledging that's what we've experienced, and then creating space for us to be restored in the midst. And I think we oftentimes don't give ourselves permission because we've been in either fight or flight mode most of our lives, or we've been in survival mode most of our lives. And the truth is, in my own faith, I'm like, I believe I was put on this earth to thrive, not just survive, right? But because of the systems and infrastructure that most of us are having to navigate as people of color, specifically as Black people, right? We sometimes are always in survival mode. And on an acute level, I understood what that looked like for me, where I looked up, into my late 20s, and I was like, oh my gosh, I've just been going 100 miles per hour, and had conflated sort of the idea of working in community with like martyrdom. And I don't believe that it is necessary for us to sacrifice our peace, sacrifice our whole being on behalf of dismantling systems we didn't build. And I think sometimes we confuse that like, okay, we're activists, we're advocates, we are doing beautiful, meaningful, necessary work. Yes, that is a truth. The other truth is our community deserves us, but what doesn't deserve us are these systems. What doesn't deserve us are the prejudiced folks who are maintaining these systems. And so it's taken a lot of work, and I can't say that I'm, still don't struggle with it, but to recognize that we don't have to be the heroes, right? I think, I was writing this article the other day, and I think about specifically Black women, where we are both the harmed and the heroes, right? So we have to endure, and then we're being called upon. And this is in every structure, not just people who identify as activists or advocates or who are, founders of organizations or running nonprofits. I'm just talking about in your everyday 9 to 5, right? How many times have you been asked to, facilitate a conversation or, create a space that feels more affirming for people that look like you? And yet that isn't reflected in your title. That's not reflected in your paycheck. And so you're being asked to do invisible labor that's not being honored for the impact that it has. And so I say that all to say that's my personal journey around it. I think collectively at Rosa Rebellion, Megan and I were really in this visceral moment where we were seeing, this is like 2018, we were seeing so many of our peers who were on the front lines, right, of the Black Lives Matter movement, who were on the front lines of, equity movements, sustainability movements, who were, if not losing their life, like I think at this point, I think we've lost like 4 activists in Ferguson to folks who've like taken their own lives. And if not that, then just being like mentally, spiritually, physically depleted. And for us, one of the biggest impetuses was seeing Erica Gardner die of a heart attack at 29. You cannot tell me that is not connected to literally embodying all the pains and stressors of having to go up against these systems that ultimately killed her father. And for us, we're like, we can't sustain these movements if we, the people, are not whole and sustained. And so what does it look like to create space where we honor our mental health, and not in the cutesy, like very like commodified way of like self-care that, is being sold to us on social media. Like you don't need a trip to Bali to restore. I mean, I wouldn't say no to a trip to Bali, but I think we can also make, and just like the habits and rituals. I also think not to generalize, but because of capitalism, because of colonization, many people of color, Black people, we have been severed from our practices of rest and our practices of restoration because we are in survival mode. And so this idea of mental health, this idea of rest, isn't necessarily familiar to us and our families and generation after generation. My maternal grandmother is 89 years old. She's fabulous. She texts our group text every day. She's a very cute Bitmoji that she created herself. And she has been doing this work for 60 plus years. And I mourn the fact, it's like a beautiful thing to be like, oh, I get to work alongside my grandmother in this larger conversation. And I glean so much wisdom. But also, why is my 89-year-old grandmother still showing up in spaces, still consulting, still teaching, right? And I have to remind my grandmother that like, it's okay to rest. It's okay to be still. And that isn't undermining your purpose. That's not undermining the larger work. That is ensuring that you remain whole in the midst of pursuing the work.
Church. You said you was going to take us there. No, I thank again, affirming, feeling. You nailed a lot of things right there, but I think the importance is rest, and we don't, as anyone within the community that think. Let me take it back a little bit. Like the hero part. Like we don't have to be the hero. Um, just follow the purpose, fulfill your do the work, but just make the initial impact. I really like that. I talk about um, first of all, I don't know anything about Austin. And I love that you shared that because in this world of entrepreneurship and everything, you start hearing about these buzz cities and spaces, and you have everyone flocking to a space, and just as anyone that is black should know, like you get there and you're like, what's going on here, right? Like no one told me that. And that is real. I didn't have knowledge that, you know, even within, I'm pretty sure Texas in general, but the D's. I'm here in Kansas City. I'm born and raised in Kansas City, so understanding like what that looks like when it comes to things that are embedded in deeds and stuff. I know we're doing a lot of work with our divide that's been here that happened, years ago within the city. So I think that for me, for a long time, it was just like, you know what you know where you are, but that awareness, even for me, is that, that, yeah, this is all around our country. And with that understanding, even for me, there's just, yeah. So it goes right back into not being so much of the hero because the work is being done, emphasizing your grandmother. Um, I know that my grandmother, always, she transitioned a few years ago, but I always share that I didn't really know much about her until she passed. Like the obituary told more of a story. Um, but I think maybe within the years that I did get a chance to experience her, she might have been resting because the story was very deep, just from being raised in like Mississippi and Alabama, like being down there, down south to coming to Kansas City, just all of that. And so and then it was like, dang, she did all of this and she worked here and she did that.
Wasn't she in her 90s? Wasn't she also in her 90s?
She was 92. And so it was around the COVID time. So, but yeah, I just think about that because there are, when you look at advocacy and things, who you see in the room is mostly the older generation. They're like they're everywhere, and I appreciate, but like you said, I think it's that constant work that we think that we got to continue doing to see change. Do you think that, is there any like tips you give people to see small changes and embrace them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but the last few years, right, has felt obviously, I mean, I was talking to some friends, like, I think we all feel like this fatigue. It's like a very consistent fatigue, like mentally, kind of spiritually, and then just physically, because there's nothing normal about seeing the atrocities that we see on a daily basis. You know, having that information download all the time of what's happening across the world. Like there's nothing normal about seeing Black and brown bodies like brutalized on Twitter, on Instagram, right? Over and over again. And so I think there's just like, particularly for millennials, right, where I think, we're digital natives and we just have this like steady pace of like trauma. And so I know for me, it's, about every 3 to 4 months, I have a little bit of like an internalized like existential crisis. And I'm like, nothing matters. Throw it all away. Like, is this all a vanity project? And my poor co-founder, Megan, will just like go on little text rants. It's like, that's right. Let's just like, when do we get to move to Wakanda? Where is Wakanda? Like, I'm tired, which I think is very healthy. So every 3 to 4 months, I think I just finished my last cycle of that. And then I get back to, I try to like center a story. And that's what like brings me back to, hey, Virginia, you were never tasked with solving the world's problems. You were tasked to respond to a certain time, a certain space, a certain place. And that's not to diminish our work, but it is to, in some ways, demonstrate a level of like gratitude and power, in that like, wow, with these hands, with this mind, with the beautiful community I've been called to, we can be a part of someone else's story. And yes, when we turn on the news and we scroll through TikTok, that doesn't feel like enough a lot of times. I'm like, oh my God, like, who cares if, Lululemon becomes a little bit more equitable when a genocide's happening across the country, across the world. Like, I understand that conflict, right? But I think in our individual spheres of influence, to leverage our giftings, to leverage the resources that we have, to leverage our own lived experience, to shift, impact, honor someone else's story is like a huge gift. And so when I have my moments of nothing matters and, the world's falling apart, I try to come back to that, a singular story, and be reminded of that. And then I think the other piece is, kind of going back to your question or your prompt earlier, April, right? About kind of like the silent struggle that, you mentioned about your mother, and then also what you have experienced, is to lean into community, because this work cannot be done in isolation. It requires collective action, and it also requires collective energy, and to be okay when you don't have it, and to let someone else be able to step in. And I think, there's probably like a little ego in that. And I think particularly as millennials, where we like have very much sort of put a high value on being at the helm of organizations and movements, and the shininess of seeing someone on TV or written up in a magazine or whatnot, that we kind of sometimes want to like hold on to our stake in the work. But I think that's a detriment to yourself, and I think it's a detriment ultimately to the larger work, if we're sometimes not willing to just sit back and be like, you know what, I don't have to be at 200% in this moment or in this season. And I think, those invisible sufferings, bringing it back to sort of the interconnectedness of, folks that are having to navigate this world differently, and navigate this world hoping that physical spaces honor their needs, right? Or, honor, being hard of hearing, or, visibly impaired. And I think as Black people, as people of color, there is an even more hyper invisibility around that. We host a program where we specifically invite white women into the work of coagitation and racial justice. And one of our participants is a psychiatrist at NYU. And she's our age, not to assume, but that we're all like in. And she was saying that as early as 2012, when she was in med school, she was still being taught in her textbook and through other professors that Black people had a higher threshold of pain tolerance, and that they needed to go through certain checks or balances before A, just believing them, and then B, supporting or serving them. And we know how that has impacted, childbirth and mortality rates, right? We know how that impacts, physical disability. And so I think about all of those silent pains. It's not just in our human capacity, but also the ways in which our world has literally been colored. And I think if we can show up in a capacity that honors our stories, I think hopefully that is the energy that propels us forward, even when it feels overwhelming. Even when, you know, you're 5 years into, or in your case, Wesley, almost 10 years into your nonprofit organization, and there's moments of questioning, like, oh, what's our impact? Or do we keep going? Or are we doing enough to like rely on the like archive of stories that you have touched throughout those 9 years?
I think that's
No,
a great question, Wes. That was such a good question.
and that was so good. I have to just say, like, it was. I have my moments too, right? Like where it's just it is overwhelming. Philanthropy is overwhelming at times because you are looking for an impact and create a change. Um, and just recently, and I appreciate you sharing that. So anyone that is within any type of work, you know, to find those small wins, to see the impacts, you know, whether you're in philanthropy or entrepreneurship, like what is that, you know, how have you changed a life or made an impact even within yours? I think that is a powerful message. I was having my own thoughts and defeats recently, just going through it, and I went through it. We're currently doing a cohort, and I'm thinking of 2025. You know, you always got to think ahead. So I'm already like, what I got to do, how we do it, do we scale small, do we go big, and just went in. One individual just kind of shared some milestones that he had hit. It's only 8 weeks. And so it was a significant one for me. And just the smile on his face was like, that's all that mattered. Like I just really honed in, like, you know what? If I got one of you, you know, that I can work with throughout the year, like it really just made me go back into the smaller picture over the bigger picture. You know, you have a vision, but the initial impact, then the small things, and making sure that you can be present for those. I think that's also like I'm just popping up, showing up, seeing people, and hearing their stories as they share them, and how our programming or things have made a change or impact, or like the family, you know, get a family member to catch you and they're like, hey, like, so I appreciate you sharing that because that was a reminder for me, and it was a recent reminder. And it filled my cup. It filled my cup up so good. I was like, you know, like I just was like, all right, I'm ready. And I'm looking for the cup to be filled by a gallon of something. And it was literally by that one seed.
You just put like you pour a little bit in the cup just so it becomes full. I appreciate that. And I was writing, I've been like typing up stuff, and a couple of things have stood out. We can be restored in the mist. And I think that's important. I think it kind of speaks to what you're saying too, Wes. It's like the little things can help restore you, right? I think that is something that we could all look to, and that we'll talk about that in a bit. Like, what do we do, and what do you do specifically to restore yourself? And you were like, you don't you don't have to be a martyr to work in community. Like, do your passion, do what you feel called for. And that was me, like a martyr as being a parent, a martyr for family, a martyr for work. And it's been recent, like literally in the last years, where I've like had to set hard boundaries. And I wasn't taught to set boundaries. I wasn't taught to say no, because that's a bad girl. You don't say no. I was taught to sacrifice myself, my time. There's so many times I would go teach a class, or I'd go help a friend at the expense of me really wanting to take care of my kids, or, you know, walk the dog, or, you know, whatever it is, cook this meal I've been planning to. And I do see that as a priority. And then come back to the question, but I want to share, Texas is not my favorite place. And I'm a California person, right? So I don't even like South.
It's a little rival between.
Yeah. So that's the whole thing. But let me tell you, I went to Afrotech last year. Oh my God. I was working at a contract. I worked with some tech nonprofits and whatnot. And people were like, April, that is not Austin. I tell you, I felt like I was in Wakanda. It was like, I stayed right across from the convention center. There's like a DJ on the corner. There were like companies and businesses and people. It was like so black and brown people, just beautiful. And you didn't think the cops were going to come. Who's the DJ on the corner playing like Glorilla and Megan Thee Stallion? And you're going in there talking to people who are making six figures plus. It was just, it filled my cup, Wes. It filled my cup. I'm not going to Houston and whatever, but I just wanted to share that was my experience with Austin. But I know,
and that's what I say. Austin is a beautiful city, and we have built over the years really affirming beautiful spaces, particularly for our Black community. I think, and kind of goes back to what you just said, April. I think, there's this ethos that maybe a lot of us were groomed in, which is kind of like servant leadership, right? And it is this idea of sacrifice and community comes first. And there's such a beautiful component to that. I'm so grateful that is the example that my parents offered me, that's what they lived out. But I now, having some, maturity and time to reflect, I recognize, like, at what cost was it necessary for my parents to always center community, right? Things that they didn't get to nurture in themselves, or and that's why we kind of center this idea of rest in the midst, because I think we've all had this idea that when people say, oh, you need to rest or take a break, they're like, I can't afford to take a couple days off. I can't afford to take a week off. I can't afford to go on a trip. We're like, no. In the midst, that means, what is it in your day-to-day that you have carved out and protected for you, for your peace? Does that mean you don't take calls until 10 a.m., right? Does that mean that at 6 o'clock you shut down, you go for a walk? Does that mean you don't work through lunch? Does that mean you start your day off with prayer or meditation? Does that mean you protect getting a workout in? Like, I have just made a rule that, like, no matter what, I work out in the morning, because that is a part of me maintaining like my mental stability. And so I think it's introducing that rest is an active posture. And I think sometimes we think of rest as like, oh, I have to shut things down and I can't afford, I got to keep all the balls in the air. And that our community is better when we get to enter it from a place of peace and from a place of wholeness. And we're not entering from a place of being depleted, right? Because we don't win awards for being depleted. And I think we can be more innovative, and we can be more creative, and we can be more joyful, right? If we're coming from a posture and a place of rest. And what I was going to say, one of the things, just sort of to be transparent, one of those sort of boundaries, as you called it, April, for me, are not boundaries, but like decisions that centered me, because honestly, it took me 34 years to realize that you could do things just because it gave you joy. Like, I was like, oh, people are out here like making life decisions around what they need, what they want, and not having to have like a 10-page PowerPoint presentation on why this will like solve the world's problems. Didn't know that. And for me, my time in Austin was so centered around community, and so centered around how do we build, nurture, and sustain spaces for us, right? Whether that was on boards I was sitting on, or physically creating spaces or whatnot. And I realized I needed a season to be replenished, and a season to evolve my toolkit in this work, and to be able to sit in a posture of receiving, which does not mean a posture of like, oh, I'm just not doing anything. I just mean like, I get to receive information. I get to receive inspiration. And so I'm talking to y'all from Brooklyn, New York. And so I moved to New York, or Brooklyn, in March of this year. And it has been just that for me. Which is being able to show up in spaces that are like an Afrotech on a Wednesday, right? Or, I'm like, people live like this where you just get to, right? Or like, I went to CultureCon earlier this week, but literally just like every Sunday on my block, there's a marketplace that is just like Black vendors. And for me, it's like, I needed this season to feel completely enwrapped, like in community that looked like me and didn't require my labor to show up in that space, right? That I got to just show up and be me. And that feels so foreign to me that I'm not joking. Ask my therapist. It took me a year and a half to arrive at that decision because it felt selfish, because it felt antithetical to my ethos around community equity. I'm like, no, but there's so much to do in Austin. And like, I could never leave. And I'm like, no, my gosh, in this season, I'm being like strengthened and encouraged and affirmed just by walking down my street to be able to show up in this work, I think, from an even more powerful way. And so for me, this is like a very in real time example of what happens when this is centering my rest, being in a space that fills me up and there's reciprocity, right? And that in that relationship. And from this posture, I even have like the mind space to like think differently and be more creative. And I think that's one of the things that racism and systemic oppression steals from us, not only like our peace and our joy, but also our innovation. Because if we're constantly in survival mode, if we're constantly just having to just respond to systems, then we are so overwhelmed with the day-to-day that we don't even have the brain space to imagine differently. And that is one of the most powerful things I think Black people do, is our ability to imagine in the most chaotic circumstances, to innovate in the most oppressive circumstances, and to be inspired in systems that were literally built, right, to steal that creativity from us. And so, yeah, I in real time and learning the what comes from centering your peace, your joy. I've been listening to this podcast, like it's like a meditation prayer podcast every morning, and the series this week was on joy. And I'm realizing that in the midst we can have joy. And I think sometimes it feels hard, like going to this protest around Gaza and just feeling like, how could I have joy when there's so much suffering? How can I have joy when there's this election that feels like it's on the precipice of stealing so much of our rights and our abilities? And I don't think they're in opposition. I think joy can be our tool for liberation. It can be our tool for resistance.
That was great. I saw you come off, Wes. And Virginia, if you don't mind, like we heard some things. We asked people like, what are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you doing? And you shared like, I work out every morning. I go to therapy. But if you would like to share the podcast, we'd love you to. And then also share how we can connect with you. And I also want to say, I felt it in my soul when you said I moved to Brooklyn and, just the landscape. And it's funny because I grew up in LA and then I lived in Atlanta for 12 years. So when I moved to Pennsylvania, I was like,
what's happening here?
And I mean, there's parts of California that are definitely all white and there's racism and craziness anywhere. But I remember taking, like my kids primarily grew up here. Now my son's in Miami and he, you just feel grounded and centered. You're like, I'm not the only tall brown person with dreadlocks. And, we were in DC hanging out. And my youngest was like, people aren't just staring at me because I'm tall and I'm brown and my hair is like all over my head. And I've been thinking of that lately. It's hard to build community when you're the only. And like, if I were to come to you or Wes and be like, I don't know, say something that's been happening in our culture, like that creativity, like, did you see that meme or you dropped that word? And a lot of, my white friends are like, oh my God, I don't know anything about it. And it's okay, but it's not, because I know everything about you. I know about Taylor Swift. I know about
That part.
Friends TV show. I know all of that because it's thrown in my face, but you can silo and isolate.
I have to know all the seasons of Sex and the City, but you've never watched Girlfriends? Excuse me?
Hello, that part. All right, Wes, I'm a mute me. You go ahead.
Yeah, so I will say, I like October felt like a little bit of a reset for me. So I was like, okay, what do I need to introduce into my rhythm? And so there's this wonderful podcast. It's called First 15. I will just, not a disclaimer, but just context that it is through a Christian lens. So if that is not necessarily your faith or your rhythm, but I will say it is, it's not theological necessarily in practice, but it's, so the idea is that you start the first 15 minutes of your day with this podcast, so that before you open up the phone and email and TikTok or do whatever you do with your to-do list, and it's really short. It's that 15 minutes. It offers just sort of a framing and then like a meditative practice. So First 15, you can do it on Spotify, and I think it's on all the other podcasts. My other piece, like I said, is working out, and not in the like necessarily like, training for triathlons, working out. But I just realized that, like, yes, of course, there's the physical components of it, but for me, it is like, it is that is a part of my mental health. If I didn't work out, I'm gonna go for a walk. That hot girl walk is a real endorphin creator. And so that is definitely part of my practice. And then you've probably seen me every during our talk. I'm a big tea drinker, and there's something, cheers. There's something so ritualistic. Like, I've never been a coffee drinker. I appreciate coffee for like the taste and as like a treat, but I love the ritual of tea. And I think there's something that it requires you to slow down a bit. Like, you have to wait for the water to brew. My brother did get me like a hot water, like, quick. And I first was like, I like, the whistling. And then I was like, you know what? This thing is very convenient. But there's still something about waiting for the water to boil, waiting for the tea bag to seep. And then you can't drink tea really fast, right? And then it kind of requires, so it's like, it gives me just even 10 minutes to like force my brain to slow down before it starts firing on all cylinders for the day. So those are probably my three things that I do just in my everyday practice. And then I think in general, this has just been a season where I'm giving myself permission, which I think is a big thing, to ask myself what I need, and what I want. And I don't think that is necessarily something that we all do often, particularly if we have the responsibilities of partnership and children, right? But I've been trying to give myself permission to ask that of myself and then act, accordingly. So yeah, I think that was your question, right? Which is like what I was doing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I love that. Oh, I love that. I work out every day. I'm like dreading because I woke up late today, so I'm like, I can't wait to work out after the call. Because even when we started, I'm sure April was sharing, I normally get out and push a trail or something early. I have to do something in my day. It's my mental. It helps my mental as well. Um, yeah, no. I think I might have. It was something that you said, and I'm trying to bring it back. I feel like I might have lost my train of thought, but no, I love where you are right now in time, and I love that you're sharing that. 2020 was a lot for me because I think I started my work a little bit before that. Being a gun violence advocate and things like that, it just got a lot. So at that time, trying to shift your role to amplify your advocacy, I ended up moving to LA in 22 or 21, like a little bit, like beginning of 22. I moved back to Kansas City uh, the end of last year, but I went to understand purpose. I went to rest. Every time people ask me what I go to, when I was like, I didn't do, I just went to rest, like I needed to breathe. And I needed to breathe from a space that I felt like I needed to do the work. And that was here in Kansas City. Now I came back because I did believe that the work that I wanted to do was here, but it took me to understand, to be filled, my cup was filled with the culture and everything there. I don't know. It was a lot of stuff. They had the black market flea, and I just love going.
Love the black market flea. My favorite shirt I got there.
Same. I got one of my favorite shirts. So like, again. It was one of those experiences, and even the access from a disability perspective, it showed me what could be possible. I think like going out, if you have the opportunity to rest and breathe and expand, I think that is valuable. So I really appreciate you sharing, and I'm excited about your journey of taking time to separate yourself to really go into your passion and purpose.
Thank you, Virginia. I can't believe it's been an hour, and we just want to share that this is going to be a podcast also, and we'll share all of that. So to live evergreen on our sites and platforms. We would love to have you, maybe you and Megan, so you could talk more about Rosa. Wouldn't that be awesome? I had this vision while you were talking. We've been talking, our Open Up team and Wes, about having WestCom, having like a mini conference, or I don't know, we would call it something. And I was like, oh my God, they would be great to come here. Okay, we're trying to, finagle Pitt. We have some stuff going on with Pitt, so I don't know, but thank you so much. Do you have any closing words you want to share?
One, just super grateful for just the spaces that y'all both nurture and the beautiful ways y'all show up in this world. And so thank you for having me. Such a wonderful way to start off my Sunday morning, my week. I think my continued encouragement is just to stay purposed, but realize that your purpose doesn't necessarily require you to sacrifice your peace. And, in 2 weeks, we got this crazy election coming up. And so just to figure out what's going to ground you. So regardless of what happens, right, we can all stay sane and stay centered. And really grateful that y'all are now a part of my community. So
yeah,
absolutely.
Cool. Everyone, thank you for joining us. I don't know, my heart is super, super full of it feels expanded with this conversation today.
Oh, ditto.
All right, everyone. Need any closing words, Wes?
Nope. Thank you guys for tuning in until next month. But absolutely, thank you for sharing everything and filling our cup this morning. I definitely going to watch church here in a minute, but you spoke
to church today, right? All right, everyone. Have a wonderful, peaceful filled Sunday.